Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Relationship Renovation Podcast. I'm Tarah Kerwin.
And I'm EJ Kerwin.
We are so grateful for all of our listeners. Thank you for checking in weekly and also giving us some amazing feedback on our social media.
You know, that's one thing I think I want to just thank everybody out there is we've had a lot more lately, people reaching out, telling us show ideas, and also a lot of people just sort of saying like, hey, this is what's going on in my relationship. You know, asking for just a word or two of encouragement. And it's just been really cool because it tells us like, hey, somebody's actually out there.
We have listeners.
Yeah. And two, that there's some value that you all are getting out of this.
Why we do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. And please keep it up. Please reach out to us. Please give us ideas. Tell us what you want to hear about.
Yeah. Thanks for letting us support you guys.
Absolutely. So we have an interview today. We are meeting with Shara Turner. She is a LPC, a licensed professional counselor. She's also a member of EAGALA, which I believe involves equine therapy.
Mm-hmm.
She'll tell us a lot more about that in a little bit. She's also EMDR trained, which is a trauma resolution technique. And she is the clinical director of Sabino Recovery, which is an amazing recovery center in Tucson, Arizona that's just doing some incredible work out there.
No, so grateful to have her here
Yeah,
today.
we're excited to have you today, Shara.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, how are you today?
I'm doing well. It's Friday, right?
It is Friday. I know, we love Fridays.
This is why we do our podcast on Fridays, because there's just like this energy to
I agree.
Yeah, there's like an uplift and a relief at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, a good place for us is always just telling us a little bit, you know, obviously we'll hear professionally, but also personally, you know, just tell us a little bit about yourself, Shara.
Well, I mean, I basically grew up in Tucson, so I've been here a long time, went to CDO High School, lived in Oro Valley. But interestingly enough, I was a stay-at-home mom for many, many years, so I didn't get into the field until later in life. But what really brought me into the field was my own experience with trauma. You know, I'm a trauma survivor. And so, you know, once I raised my kids and I thought, I need something, I need a passion, I was just naturally drawn to this field. So I went back to school, got my master's, got my license, kind of moved up really quickly in the field. And I started out by working in public health, which was beautiful and enlightening and a great experience. But over time, I didn't feel like there was enough of a focus on trauma. There was more of a focus on the medical model and really just stabilization. So I found Sabino Recovery. Really, they found me, but I feel like it's my home because that focus on integrative, holistic, individualized care and really looking at what's underneath the individual, not just the symptomology, is what I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
So
we've had a number of podcast episodes now that focus on trauma. And when we kind of look at our analytics of episodes is they are most listened to episodes.
Wow.
They're also the episodes that people listen through. Like they listen to the entire thing.
They don't just stop at 5 minutes.
No, absolutely. And so there's something about this topic about, you know, going through very troubling times and trying to figure out how to deal with it, that people are searching for information all the time.
Right, right.
And I think with the pandemic hitting us all and kind of that feeling of like not having control and almost that it brought up a lot of trauma for people that maybe didn't even like look at it before. This is why we see such a pouring out of people really looking for mental health services and especially like wanting to deal with trauma and process through whatever is happening to them right now.
Could you tell us, so just, you know, continue on the personal side just a little bit, what was really that link for you that went from not just like, hey, I'm, you know, personally growing and using, you know, mental health services to help myself, but wanting to cross the gap and be like, I want to do this. Like, I want to be involved in this. Good
question.
Yeah. I mean, to be completely frank, my first husband had a substance abuse issue. And so that's what really propelled me into this realm, into this field, because I saw him go from treatment center to treatment center to treatment center on the 12-step model and never really got better. This isn't a knock against anybody, but that was the reality, because he had this underlying, you know, narrative of never being good enough from a father who abandoned him as a kid, and no one ever got into that. They just wanted to focus on the 12 steps and the alcohol
and the behavior.
Yep.
So, you know, it just really, him in and of itself is what really propelled me into this field. And then once I started to kind of dig in and get the knowledge and the experience, I was like, I love this. I love seeing people actually get better. So
it was like you were seeing them not go to like the core issues of what's really happening for that person suffering. And
it's frustrating. It is, because it's so, you have to address that.
I know. And somehow I always find when like as a therapist, when you're compelled because of your own life experience, there's just that like level of empathy and understanding, and you can't get it from a book, can't get it from a theoretical approach. Sometimes I feel like things happen to us or me universally because it's like, okay, you're going to go through this, so then you can try to help others. Yeah. But you have to get through it yourself first.
I think there's also something like when you see something going on that you see like, well, that it's not happening right. Like, it's not working. There's something about when somebody comes into a field and it's because they think like, hey, this can be done better, that like propels them to do like really cool stuff, and to sort of push the edge and not just sort of be a follower, and I think that's what grows any field. And I know that's certainly like Tarah and I, that was a big part of when we started focusing just on couples, was like this idea of like, there's something in the way in which we got taught how to do this that doesn't seem like it's working very well, or whatever our instincts, if we're relying just on instincts, isn't working very well.
Well, and I just wanted to go back to what you were saying, Tarah, about we have to go through it to really be able to sit in someone's shoes and offer that kind of empathy. I read a book actually back in my 30s by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I'm sure you've all heard of
amazing.
it. And that, when he talked about making meaning out of your adversity, that's probably the moment that the light went off with me. I was like, oh my God, I can actually help people because of what I went through. And then that just kind of carried me into the field altogether. So
I just have goosebumps because I remember that moment too when I was at Reed Park crying, pushing these twins. And I called EJ. I'm like, he said, she said, we have to open up a couples counseling center.
I got chills now.
And EJ's like, I don't like working with couples, honey.
They're too hard.
I said, listen to me. But no, I remember that moment. It was so clear. And it took a couple of years for it to manifest. But here we are like 7 years later. So
it's amazing.
Goosebumps.
Yeah.
Well, and then also like once you identify what you're passionate about, what you care about, doing it over and over and over again, I think also is like specialization is like,
absolutely,
so important. I think that's a great segue maybe into first talking about Sabino Recovery. I mean, that's how we met you. You guys came down to our facility and talked to all of our therapists. Right. I mean, could you tell us a little bit about Sabino Recovery?
Yeah. So we're a trauma program. I mean, we are duly licensed for mental health and substance abuse, but everything we do is through a trauma lens. It's never, what's wrong with you. It's always about what happened to you. What happened to you that dysregulated your nervous system to such a place that you continue to engage in unhealthy patterns of behavior to regulate. People don't understand that regulation of the nervous system is a survival mechanism, right? We're always going, why does someone drink so much? Why do they do that? Instead of understanding it's adaptive. It's survival, addiction survival. But we have to get in there from a concept of neuroplasticity and start changing the way that brain is wired. Yeah. And that's really what our program is built on, the concepts of neuroplasticity, the holistic view of the person and not just the behavior, not just the diagnosis. So that's what we do.
Addiction is survival. I just have to repeat that because that is beautiful, but also like it can feel overwhelming too. But I just love that. I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's a big shift? Because I remember even because Tarah and I both came out of working in treatment centers as well, like that the model was always go to treatment for the behavior that is problematic. Yeah. And it sounds like Sabino Recovery is shifting it a little bit to come for the reason, trauma. And I imagine you get a wide umbrella of people's maladaptive, behaviors.
Right. And when I talk about addiction, I'm definitely not just talking about drugs and alcohol, right?
Yeah.
I mean, gambling, sex, shopping. I mean, right now, internet, phones, that's one of the biggest addictions we have. What a distraction from the world around us, and I think about these kids that have been kind of sequestered in their homes through the pandemic, how much they relied on that phone for social interaction, so it's going a little bit back to the pandemic. We're kind of living in a culture of scarcity and fear, and everyone's kind of chronically dysregulated. Yeah. So I think that's why addiction is on the rise, again, as an adaptive measure for survival and for homeostasis in the body. So
who comes to Sabino Recovery? I mean, I think that's an important thing for people to understand. And so it's a program based upon treating trauma. But who's the person who calls you guys up?
Oh boy, it's a wide variety. I mean, we have anything from, the 18-year-old child who's been smoking marijuana since they were 13 because never really learned how to connect or adapt to their environment outside of that, been playing video games their whole life, that kind of presentation. but was bullied in school, may have the perfect childhood, but was bullied in school and doesn't understand that's traumatic, to the 65-year-old attorney who's been working his whole life, maybe drinking on the side, doing a little cocaine here and there, didn't think it was a problem until they started to get older and couldn't work as much, right? So again, that's the wide spectrum. We get a lot of sexual developmental trauma. Young women that have been trafficked happens, unfortunately, more than I wish it did. Yeah. We get a lot of people that come in with secondary eating disorders. And once they start processing that trauma, that eating disorder rises up again because that's their protection. So really,
just all over the place.
It's all over the place. Yeah, it really is.
Wow.
One thing I'm hearing, because I think when I'm working here on an outpatient level and I say the word trauma, I think some people think, oh no, there hasn't been any traumatic moments, because they think of trauma as this big moment happening that was very destabilizing. And I really try to educate them on, what trauma is, and that trauma is, again, under a big umbrella. How do you define trauma?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I always tell this story because it's so poignant to me. I had a gentleman come in, and he was about 40 years old and a really successful accountant in New York, and came and sat at my desk and said, Shara, I had a perfect childhood. I've had no trauma. I just drink too much. So fix me, basically.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, fair enough. I said, well, let's talk about your child. And he said, well, the one thing I do remember in the 5th grade, I was moved from private school to public school. I was kind of small and scrawny, and I was horribly bullied. We're going back to the bullying, but I have no trauma. I define trauma by anything that affects that person on such a visceral level and creates a narrative of deficiency that they carry with them throughout life. And they will find any means necessary to medicate that dysregulation and that narrative of deficiency. That's how I define trauma. And it's relative for every person. What's traumatic to one person may not be for the other. Right. But then again, you're going to go into a whole realm of resiliency. It also depends on their resiliency, how many supports they have in their life. What's their environmental state like, around the people around them, what kind of support. So there's a lot of factors, but trauma is definitely not one definition.
And I think that it sounds like that everyone's kind of in an environment together, and they can kind of see this array of different experiences, and maybe have this experience that wow, yeah, there's it's on a whole different level, that there's so many different pieces to it. Yeah. Is there a limit of people that can be at Sabino Treatment Center? Is there
So we have, we're a 30-bed unit.
30-bed unit.
And we will never go bigger than 30.
That's amazing.
Yeah, because you can't continue to instill that individualized treatment when you go higher than that, and it's really challenging. And I don't believe that it's one size fits all. You have to treat the person where they're at. And so we throw a lot of things at them and kind of see what works. And then as part of their treatment, we formulate a plan for them when they leave, because that continuing care is so important. People think they're going to go into therapy or treatment or residential or outpatient, either one, and put in all this work for 2 to 3 months, and then everything's going to be fine.
Yeah.
You have to keep doing that work for a significant amount of time for that neuroplasticity to really start working.
Yeah, that's an important question, I think, is how do you conceptualize recovery from trauma, right? Because, it's one of the things around, maybe drinking or eating disorder, you can have a very sort of quantifiable way. Well, if I'm not drinking, I'm doing well, or if I'm, maintaining a healthy weight. But when it comes to how do you look at what is the pathway of recovery from trauma, right? Because it's not the door just closes and it's done, right?
Yeah. Boy, I think it's different for everyone, but I will say, and I'm going to go off on just EMDR specifically for a minute. When you do EMDR with a person, it's not that the memory goes away. It just feels less daunting. It doesn't feel as heavy, right? Because you're reprocessing it from that lower brainstem into the frontal lobe so that you can rationalize it a little bit more. So it doesn't have the same effect on the nervous system. So that's one modality. Yeah. SE work, which is also amazingly efficient for trauma, is really getting a person to understand and get more in touch with their bodily sensations, because our physiology never lies to us. Our frontal lobe, this brain, lies to us all the time, right? That voice. But the physiology never lies. And so children, especially with developmental sexual trauma, are so disconnected from their body because their body had a reaction, to the attention, and yet they knew it was bad, right? So they're living in this dichotomy. So they just had completely, as a survival mechanism, have disconnected from their body, and they don't trust their body anymore. But that's where we get our reactions from. Yeah. That's where our instincts come from. So I don't know that I'm answering the question exactly, EJ, but it's a big answer and it's a process over a specific period of time. But it's about getting in touch with your body, learning how to regulate your own nervous system. You know, again, from a personal note, I've had anxiety my whole life because I'm a trauma survivor. I had trauma as a child. I've learned how to deal with my anxiety. My anxiety is not gone. It will never go away. But I've learned how to deal with it and channel it in healthy ways.
I mean, so let me just recapitulate and see if I heard this correctly. It's that an individual becomes much more aware of the way in which they're being maybe unconsciously activated by this trauma. And then they're on a pathway of being aware and then maybe diminishing its impact and maybe having ways in which they actually cope with it in a healthy way.
I could never have said it that good.
I know. He's really good.
Really good.
I ran it through my robot brain.
Yeah, that was very good. Thank you.
I was going to say really quickly, I just relate a lot because trauma survivor here too. Yeah. And I remember that anxiety, I used to feel like it controlled me and it was horrible. And I mean, I would just isolate myself and I was specializing in anxiety in my private practice. I'm like, this isn't anxiety. Right. And then once I did all of the trauma work, it's like I have total control now. I know. Like it feels so good. And the anxiety's still there, but it doesn't hijack me. I hijack it. And I said, no, hold on.
It doesn't hijack me. I hijack it. That's beautiful. Again, beautiful.
That's new. That just came up out of it. I'm so good. Yeah. No, I'm kidding.
So another important question, because if one of the premises is it like that gentleman you were talking about, he didn't even realize how it was affecting him. Right. What are the things you can tell somebody out there like, hey, watch out for these things. These are the things that might tell you that you are being affected by some trauma within your life.
Right. Well, I think one of the biggest ones is the anxiety piece. You know, if you're living in this chronic sympathetic nervous system state, which many people don't realize, but it's that hypervigilance. Yeah. You're always on guard. When you hear a loud noise, if you jump, that's a sign of a dysregulated nervous system. If you're using substances of any kind, or you feel like you're over shopping. I mean, there's something in your life that you're doing in a maladaptive way. It's very likely it's connected to some kind of trauma that you don't want to look at. It's a distraction not to deal with that trauma. And if you're just not feeling whole, I think people that are trauma survivors, there's a void inside of them because they've been running and surviving their whole life. Yes. And so feeling that the kind of white knuckling going through life, that's a true sign that there's probably some work to be done.
Okay. So good. We always speak with our interviewees before we come on. And one thing you mentioned that you just mentioned it and we didn't dig into it at all was the 3-stage trauma model. And I thought that again, the more we can educate people and give them, sort of a way in which to look at this, the more they become empowered in maybe doing something. Right. So can you tell us about the 3-stage trauma model?
So that's another, our program's kind of based on the 3-stage trauma model, and that is safety, processing, and reintegration. There's nothing more important than a person that comes in to do work that they feel safe and they don't feel judged. Because with trauma, there's so much shame, there's so much judgment on the self that if you walk into an office and you feel that judgment coming from the person in front of you, there's no work that's going to happen. No. So safety is so important. Once you've established that safety with the person you're working with, then you go into the processing. And that can happen in such a wide variety of ways. Again, EMDR, somatic experiencing, accelerated resolution therapy that was relatively new.
ACT.
It's beautiful. And in fact, I just went to a training last week for NARM, Neuroaffective Relational Model. Beautiful model in treating trauma and developmental trauma specifically. So there's a lot of different ways. And again, one size doesn't fit all. It's what resonates with the person. But that's that processing phase. And then you go into reintegration. And that's really important because you're bringing now the family and the loved ones into the process. Yeah. At Sabino, that's how we formulate their whole stay. Let's say they're there for 35 days. We start with safety, processing, and then in the 4th week of treatment, we bring the family in. It doesn't always have to be blood family. It could be, a loved one, a cousin, a best friend, whoever their support system is. We bring them into that process so that they can start speaking that language and understanding what that person's been through. Because there's nothing harder than to leave the bubble of residential and go out into the world and feel alone after you've gotten all the support, you've opened up and been vulnerable, and to go out and have nobody get you or understand you. So it's the reintegration piece of that trauma model is vitally important to recovery.
I love that. That's so important there, because the aftercare piece, like, it could even be more detrimental if you don't have it. Like, you have that safety for however many days, and then you don't have that support system when you get out, or there haven't been plans made. And so I know it takes work after that initial phase.
Right. And I think about too, from a place where you guys work, couples counseling most mainly. I mean, imagine, you've got one of the spouses is dealing with trauma and the other doesn't understand it. If the other person doesn't come into that process, they're still not going to understand it. Yeah. So it's really important to enlist some empathy and compassion by educating the other spouse on what they're dealing with.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we have a couple EMDR therapists here at our center, but there's something so connecting when we start to process trauma. We do the whole genogram and timeline process with our couples. And when they can be in it together and and they'll be like, oh, should we do this individually? And I say, absolutely not. Like, this is where you build compassion and understanding, because you guys have never been able to talk about it in this safe place. You've just been reacting to what you don't know that's underneath there.
Yeah.
I had a couple yesterday, like, he gets super defensive because she's got a ton of anxiety, consistent, hyper exaggerated hypervigilance for probably over 10 years.
Yeah.
And it's not about him, because they've only been together for 5. And I'm just trying to help him understand, like, look, when she says, you can't control me, I'm the adult here, that's a sign that she's in dysregulation, and you have to hold that space for her. And he's like, but I just feel like I'm being blamed and I'm this monster. And I'm like, no, I know. But she's going to be working on her own individual self. But this is how and I'll probably be talking about that for weekly sessions with them for a while, because it takes a lot of awareness to try to be open to your partner who is really suffering and not take it personally. When you get there, that's when couples don't have to be here anymore.
Well, that's the importance, and also like the total like complexity of a family or a couple is the fact that, like, yes, you might have like there generally is sort of like the primary person who's been identified as like their suffering has much more of an impact on a relationship than the other person, right? But that doesn't mean, like you said, that like almost everybody has some level of, little t, middle t, big T trauma. And then when your partner is activated, you become activated. Because we tend to focus in front of our nose instead of behind our nose. we sit and we're like, well, just get him or her, fixed, and then I'll be fine. But really, that person is getting triggered and doesn't have the ability to do what you're talking about, which is like, oh, okay, I got to like really hold this safe space for this individual, because they're acting in their autonomic, unhealthy way to a stressful situation. And it's complex. It's so hard to help families and couples change. I mean, how is that for you guys when you have this individual who's done this work individually, because they've gotten to pull out of their system, and then you put them back into it? What's that like to watch?
We've had interesting outcomes with that, certainly.
I love if you could see the face language.
Right? And I will say most of the time they're really positive outcomes. When someone's really invested in their way of being, specifically if there's some remnants of personality disorder going on, that makes it a little more difficult to get in there and get some accountability and awareness going on. And there hasn't been one family program that I've been through at Sabino, and that's almost 3 years, that I haven't seen some type of shift in that family system. You can't help but not, because we kind of inundate them with information they've never heard before, and then they do this, kind of communication exercise, when I feel, it's that whole owning your feeling kind of thing. And it's extremely powerful if no one's ever talked to each other that way. If it's always like, you did this and you made me feel that way, the blaming. The minute you step back and own your stuff, the walls go down and you actually start hearing each other. And so just that moment of actually hearing somebody, you see the light go off. And again, the work has to continue. Yeah.
The work has to continue, because one of the things that we've noticed here is, and I always will say, like in the first session, you guys, when you don't want to come back to couples counseling because you feel like this is it, that is the sign of shift. Like, you've been in this homeostasis, even though it's dysfunctional for so long. And when one person changes, it changes the system, and people don't want change. Even if it feels bad, they don't want it. And so when couples are like, this isn't working, we're not coming back, that is a sign that it's about to shift. Hold on, white knuckle it for a couple weeks. because if one person shifts, the entire system has to change. And so, and a lot of people, if you're not educating them, they won't know what's really happening at an unconscious level, and they'll try to enable it to go back to the way it was. And so the more education you're doing for families, partners, whatever, around this kind of unconscious shift from to a different homeostasis that's healthier and feels better is huge. And that's where the continuing work goes, because it's not like just a light switch that happens.
That's so great. I heard this quote once, that people will choose a known pain over an unknown pleasure.
Wow.
Because it's what we know. I mean, change feels so scary. And that little ego mind of ours that, we have a hard time controlling is like, no, you need to be this way. This is your survival, right? Yeah. But we don't have control over that subconscious thought as much as we wish we did. And it's challenging. But just holding space for that challenge, right, is what we do. And it's beautiful.
I mean, I think one of the amazing things that you offer at Sabino Recovery is you sort of alluded to it a little bit ago, is the fact that you have a broad range of ways in which you can help an individual, because what might work for one individual might not work for another. And when you're in outpatient, you kind of pick a therapist, and we generally have, something we do well, or maybe two things, and you can offer 7, 8 and see what really sticks. And so, I mean, it might also be really helpful for our audience to hear it. Can you tell us about like a few of the therapies that you offer there, and give us a little bit of like understanding of what they are too?
Yeah, of course. So somatic work. Somatic work is really just getting in touch with your body, what's happening in your body, what those sensations are, because trauma gets stored in the body, right? And then we have a visceral reaction to stimuli in the environment, and we react without even understanding why we're reacting to something small. It's the cat that looks like the tiger. And so that's really somatic work. EMDR is, through bilateral stimulation, getting into that lower brain stem, reprocessing that memory, instilling new narratives around that memory or new cognitions. It shows a lot of efficacy. ART, accelerated resolution therapy, is kind of an offshoot, I want to say, of EMDR. It's got a different protocol to it, and it doesn't require the person to tell the story. It actually changes the picture of the story without them having to tell it. So it's really effective for people that have a hard time relaying those kind of deep, dark, And again, I go back to sexual trauma, because sexual trauma is so shameful. Yeah. And then equine. We do equine therapy. We were going to talk about that a little bit. So equine therapy is a beautiful, mindful practice that incorporates some narrative therapy into it. Because what happens is residents will go in the arena and kind of observe the horses. And then you ask them what they see. And the stories they start to tell about the horses are really stories they're telling about themselves. And then how they show up in that arena energetically, the horses instinctively, because they operate from their limbic system, not their frontal lobe, will mirror back whatever you're bringing that to arena. And so in a non-judgmental way. And so they're able to see like, oh my goodness, this is how I'm showing up. Yeah. So it's really, like, to me, that's one of the most beautiful ways, especially when people don't want to put words to their trauma. They can have these conversations, these kind of subliminal conversations with horses. It's really, it's just, you have to see it to really understand how powerful that is. And the one thing we do as well that shows, again, a lot of efficacy for developmental trauma is brain mapping and neurofeedback. That's one of the things I love, because you're able to pinpoint in the brain where some of the deficiencies are. Like someone with anxiety, there's the alpha waves are low, or the beta waves are high. And then we have specific protocol through neurofeedback that helps us exercise the brain. So it's very empowering in that realm. But that's some of the highlights of what we do.
Well, I mean, and if any of those really jumped out to a listener, I'd love to make sure we have in our show notes. And so check it out, a link to each one of those therapies that Shara just spoke about. We'll make sure that there's a link to like kind of a primary source for you all to take a deeper dive into them. Yeah. But yeah, no, that's super useful.
I'm blown away. I wish I could just go to Sabino Canyon for 30 days.
Okay, thank you, Tarah. You are like queen of segue. There we go.
I didn't even know.
Okay, so residential treatment, right? Like now that's
queen of segue.
Let's talk just about that for a second, because I think that can, to Tarah, that sounds like heaven, like getting, but for some, and I know I certainly had this experience with clients where you bring that up and they're like, no way, you know? So what are the sort of like obstacles that people face, and then what are the benefits?
Well, and you're right, there's a stigma to going to residential treatment. Like, I must really be broken if I have to go into inpatient treatment or something of the like. I think and I don't even want to put a number on it, but there is a lot of people in this world that could benefit from doing some type of residential setting. Because the benefit of going into residential setting is that you're able to immerse yourself into recovery. It's like immersion. Like if you're going to go to a new country and learn a language, right? It's better just to go there and be immersed into that culture. It's the same kind of thought process and idea, because our habits and behaviors are so powerful because we've been doing them for a really long time. To make that kind of sustainable change on an outpatient basis is challenging and takes more time.
Right.
Because what happens, you go into the therapy office and you have this great session, but then you go out in the world and you've got all your triggers around you, right? Someone cuts you off in traffic, you get pissed off. You know, husband leaves the toilet seat up, you get pissed off. You know, like there's triggers everywhere. When you're in residential, you're in this bubble. We take away distractions. We take away a lot of, not all, but some triggers. So you're able to really focus in on that trauma. You know, EMDR specifically, again, can be really activating. And it's much better for me to activate someone in an inpatient level so that they have that support than to do an EMDR session in an office and send them out on the street. You know, it just, the changes are so much more sustainable because, again, it's the immersion piece of it into that neuroplasticity. You get that started on a much quicker basis. So
it's like when I'm working, I used to work with children on a lot of like sexual trauma, and the parents would like drop them off at my office. This is when I was in California, like, here's my child. And I'm like, oh, no. You're coming in here too. I'm not about to do some play therapy with this 4-year-old who's experienced sexual abuse. And he's going to go home and you guys aren't going to know how to support him and create that safe environment. I said, this is really important, and it's all of us here together making those efforts to create safety, because if you go home after an intensive therapy and you don't have that safety, it could make it worse. The person could suffer more.
It makes it worse, and then you jump right back into maladaptive coping mechanisms for the survival.
I can't handle this. This is too overwhelming. So that's, to me, that safety of residential like gives an individual space to be who they need to be, where they need to be, without all of that extra crap we have to deal with in real life.
Well, and EJ, I think to your point, like a lot of people have this idea of residential treatment that people are coming in there because they got their third DUI, or they got arrested for drugs, or they haven't been able to get out of bed for 2 months or something. It's that dire that they go into residential. And actually it's the opposite. We get a lot of people that come in that are kind of just white knuckling their life and have realized, I can't do this anymore. I want to change. So
go in and get support before you crack, before you
go to that.
Bottom.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So how does one start exploring it? Like, because I've found a lot in mental health from all levels, from outpatient all the way to residential, is people just don't understand the whole process of it. They don't get it. So, I mean, how does someone begin to explore this? Like, how do they even enter into the stream of thinking, hey, is this an option for me?
Right. I think it probably starts with their outpatient provider, whether it's the doctor or their therapist, making those recommendations like, hey, I don't see you getting a lot better through this process. Maybe you need something a little more intensive. Usually that's where it's driven, or a family member can say, hey, I kind of see things reverting back to the way they were, or going downhill a little bit. Maybe we need to explore some other options. Usually not driven by the individual, unfortunately, because they don't see it for themselves. So it's driven by an outside source. And then there's so many resources. I mean, you can just Google, residential treatment. You're going to get a slew of residential treatment centers. It's hard to discern which one to go to. It really depends on what the presenting issue is. There's a lot of organizations in the country, we call them ed consultants, that's their very job. They're treatment placement specialists. So they help people find the right treatment center for them. So you could just look up, treatment specialist or treatment placement specialist or something online, and that would give you all the resources you need.
I mean, I think we have a decent amount of clinicians who listen to our show too. And so, I mean, one thing that I think is important is that we have a bunch of these different things to offer our clients, because we will eventually be in front of a client who has a need that, fits Sabino Recovery. And so, and if you don't know it, you don't know it. So, I mean, one thing that we really loved about you guys was, we're local, so we're lucky enough that you guys could come down and sit in front of us and we could talk. But I'm sure if you're a clinician, right, anywhere in Idaho, South Dakota, that they can give Sabino Recovery a call, and you guys would be happy to tell them all about it.
Absolutely. So not only can they give us a call and we can talk about Sabino, but anyone that calls in looking for treatment, and let's say it's not financially feasible or it's not the right fit for whatever reason, we will always refer out. So we never just say, sorry, we're not the right fit. I mean, that's part of what we do is giving resources to somebody, whoever calls in. So yeah, of course, that's always an option.
Yeah. I'll tell you that goes a long way. That is something that Tarah has been amazing with our facility over the years is that we've she at first, when it was just the two of us, would spend a half hour, 45 minutes on the phone with somebody. We weren't the right place for them, but given them some ideas of where to go. And now our front of house people now do the same thing. And man, people are they're so incredibly appreciative,
they're amazed by it.
But it gives them some place to go because so many times people Google a name and they run into a wall. Somebody's just like, no, I'm not taking clients. It's like, oh, well,
it makes them want to give up on the process too. That's why I'm like, listen, here's this person that accepts this insurance. This might be, I'm just like, don't ever let anyone, whether it's they're emailing or calling, leave without some kind of direction because they're already feeling hopeless. Yeah. And right now there's just such a wait list for services and,
And so, a word to people out there that are listening that are struggling to find a couples counselor or an individual counselor to handle some trauma from their past is that don't give up. Make a couple phone calls. Go outside of your market because you might, you could call somebody like Sabino Recovery and they might say hey, well, I actually know 2 or 3 therapists because you guys keep databases
we do.
of local markets and say hey, call this person, and this person. Right. So, go beyond that initial sort of wall you hit because eventually you'll hit somebody. There's a lot of people in this field who actually really care and want to help you, even if it's not them that's going to help you.
Agreed completely. And we've got a whole slew of outreach people that are out there, vetting resources. Yeah. So when someone does call in and they don't even live here, let's say they live in another state, we've got someone specifically in that state that knows what resources we have and can refer out. So yeah, again, agreed. You got to make a couple phone calls. Don't just take no for an answer.
So just to sort of wrap up a little bit on the side of Sabino Recovery, somebody is listening to this and they're like, wow, I'd like to learn more about this place. What do you tell them? How do they find you?
Yeah, I would just calling up and we'll get you to the admissions department. They'll have a conversation with you. I know all of them personally. They're wonderful people. They just really want to help. And again, if it's the right fit, we'll see if we can figure out a way to get you in the door. If not, we'll refer you out and make sure you get the resources you need.
Great.
Wow. Just sounds like Sabino just does such great work, very holistic, and then just aftercare is very important and that you guys really do a great job in integrating them back into the environment after they've done some really deep work. So that's huge.
And it's an incredibly beautiful place. We're actually coming to visit you guys on Monday, but I know Sabino Canyon, for people who don't live here, is just an absolutely gorgeous area of Tucson.
Yeah.
Tucson is an interesting place in that way too, as far as how many healing institutions, how many people have wound their way through Tucson in their path of sort of getting back on their feet.
Yeah.
I always joke, I call
There's
it
something about healing here. Yeah. I remember when I first visited here and I was like, I have to be here.
Tucson is the second chance capital of the world. That's what joke.
I love that.
Did you make that up?
I don't know if I made it up. I'll take credit for it. It's not copyrighted, but
Second chance. Okay. We'll talk later. I don't know what that means.
All right. Well, Shara,
amazing to have you here and meet you and just see all of the beautiful work you do as clinical director of Sabino and just how much you care and also the equine part. I just want to go and find an individual therapist that does equine right now.
Well, that must be fun to be the clinical director of that place.
I love it. I love, you can tell. Love my job. I'm very passionate about what we do. And the most important thing to me and what I lose sleep over is not staying in our integrity. So, I talked to you guys a little bit before we started this about, I was looking for a family therapist and we didn't have anybody. And so I capped us at 23 people. I was not going to take any more people until we had enough staff to serve those people. And I don't think there's a lot of residential facilities or CEOs that would respect the clinical director enough to say, you know what, you're right. We promise you're going to get when you walk through that door. And that I take that very, very personally and very seriously, what we do.
Yep.
But hey, when you come out anytime you guys want to do a little team builder or something, come out. We'll do an equine session. I would do that in a heartbeat.
Yes. That'd be awesome. But I'm hearing quality over quantity.
Quality over quantity. I like that.
That is at my heart too.
Yeah.
Well, I think it would be really fun to have you back again. So
I love it.
We'll definitely ask you to come back because it's been a great conversation. I think a lot of good information for people. Again, we'll do our best to give you really thorough show notes with links to a lot of the things we spoke about. Thank you, Shara.
Thank you very much.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
All right. So as always, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. It's kind of what we've got right now.
Absolutely. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Me and you just singing on the train. Me and you listening to the rain. Me and you, we are the same. Me and you have all the fame we need. Indeed, you and me are we.